Today on the India Growth Mission Council, we're going to be talking about the issue of employment and how policymakers in some states want to resort to quotas and reservation of seats for those who are from the state. That means domiciles even in the private sector. Now, one particular case pertaining to the state of Haryana and its law, which came into effect from the 15th of Jan this year, to reserve 75% of jobs for locals for salaries below 30,000 rupees, has been challenged. The Supreme Court lifted the stay that the Haryana High Court, the Punjab and Haryana High Court had put in place, and it will go now back to the High Court. Now, even as that legal process goes on, it's important to know that Haryana is not the only state who has attempted this or is contemplating this. Before this, the states of Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, for example, have this law in place or want to put this law in place one way or the other. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about whether quotas in private sector really help with the issue of unemployment for youth. Does it help or does it harm? Now, to speak on this, I'm joined today by Jitendra Gupta, Co-Chair Law and Justice Committee of the PhD Chamber. Madan Sabanvis, Chief Economist at the Bank of Baroda, is joining us on the show today. And I'm also speaking with Rituparna Chakravarti, EVP and co-founder of Teamly Services. Welcome to all of you and thank you so much for speaking with us. Let me begin by getting your perspective, Mr. Gupta, because industry has been fighting this tooth and nail. You went to the High Court earlier fighting against this, and now you will be back in the High Court, where the High Court has actually been asked to look at this case on merit and in greater detail. Can you explain to us why this should be an issue if, as the Haryana government says, they have very easy rules on this? The cutoff is for those being employed below 30,000. If you can't find those people, you can employ from outside. They have given exemptions for IT industry and startups for 2 years. So they're doing their bit. Can you explain to us why you think this is an issue for industry?
One, it does not only confine to industry, particularly in Haryana. This act is applicable to all enterprises, whether it's a shop or an office or a society. Even a school or a college or a hospital will be covered under this ambit. So it is not an industry specific thing. Second is the larger issues of the constitutionality. Before we go into the merits of this law, whether a state government is or a central government is empowered to bring in reservation in the private sector. So far we have seen the reservations are there in the government sector or the reservation are there in the education sector, again controlled by the government. But this is an attempt for the private sector employment, which has not happened so far. So the industry or the employer feels as a direct interference by the political establishment into the day-to-day working of the employers. And eventually they also feel that it is contrary in spirit to the ease of doing business. It is like every business will be interfered and tomorrow the recommendations will come from the political class or the bureaucratic class. And at the end of the day, it is an indirect way of Inspector Raj in every organization. That's the thinking behind the. And then, of course, there are certain industries which have specific talent pool requirement. Like I said, the hospitals will be covered. Now, we all know that the nurses from Kerala, they are the most suited for the job. Now, tomorrow, if I'm running a hospital and I have to employ nurses, then I'll have to first find out nurses within the state of Haryana who are domiciled here, and if I'm not, then I may go for exemption. So it will be a cumbersome process. It's not a seamless thing that as it goes in today. That's my preliminary thought about this.
Okay, now, Madan Sabanvis, it's very easy to just look at this simply as these are lollipops being handed out by political parties before elections. It's, to woo voters, etc. But behind this is a really serious issue of lack of employment and lack of stable employment that the youth of the country want. So if I just look at the latest CMIE data coming in for the month of January, employment shrunk by 3.3 million and the employment rate dropped to 37.2%. Labor force participation has also dropped. So there is little doubt that this is a big issue. Why do you think governments want to resort to quotas once again to try and find a solution for this?
So actually, Tamanna, if we're looking at this issue of employment, I think it has to be looked at the national level. So it is true that the government of India, through its budget, is not able to generate employment. It has to come from the private sector. Now, when we're talking of the private sector, now where exactly it's being generated will depend upon where the business lies. Okay, if I have an opportunity in a particular state, that's where I'm going to employ. That's where I'm going to set up my unit, and I'm going to employ the right people for a particular kind of job. So, to my mind, any kind of interference which comes in the private sector in a form of reservations would actually hinder the private sector activity, and ideally it should not be the case, because we already have a case of saying that, for example, today if you are located here in Mumbai, wherever any enterprise whichever has the office, at the lowest level, I think that the hiring has to take place from the locality. We're not just saying that a person has to be from Mumbai. For example, if I stay in a location of Andheri and my office is in Andheri, the local people only will have to come, and they will be the ones who will be doing the housekeeping kind of jobs. So the menial jobs have actually already been reserved. I think there are certain municipal rules which ensure such things happen. Now, when you're saying 30,000 rupees, to my mind, is actually closer to a white collar kind of job, and you're actually coming in the way in terms of getting the right kind of talent. And as was said earlier, doing this retrospectively will create a lot of confusion. It'll create a lot of disruption for private enterprise, and there may be a big incentive today not to actually do business in certain states where you have these kind of regulations. And the second point is that whatever we do cannot be done retrospectively. If at all you're going to do such a thing, which I don't think is the right thing, but it should be done only prospectively.
No, so the Haryana government's rule is for implementation prospectively. It does not say retrospectively. And it also gives some kind of buffer to companies that have started after Jan 15th or for the IT sector, although just for a couple of years. Ritu, before I come to you, Rituparna, just what the other point of view is, and there's a quote of the Haryana Chief Minister in an interview given recently where he says that we don't anymore get major revenues from industry because of GST. Most of our revenues are consumption-led. So if they're not going to give us massive revenues, the least they should do is give us employment, because we are giving them concessions. We're giving them concessions for land, for water, for electricity, etc. Do you think there's any merit to that argument that a state government or any government gives concession to industry to help them, to aid them, and in turn they expect employment for their local population?
Okay, so I think first and foremost, I think this whole argument itself seems to be very inadequately, inappropriately construed. I think the role of the government is to create incentives and an ecosystem which creates massive number of jobs within the state. And when that happens, whether employment is created for local youth or elsewhere, finally those people living within that ecosystem, within that state, are going to use that employment money to spend and increase consumption within that particular state. So this argument that because we are getting less GST and we are giving them the ecosystem, I'm not sure I understand what this ecosystem is. This is the basic premise of the government. This is something that the least that the government can do for the benefit of the state, its youth. And to be honest, when you started off, Tamanna, you said that whenever we are approaching them with this debate that, well, this is anti-ease of doing business and so on and so forth, they're coming up saying, oh, this is just for wage level 30,000 and below. And if they do not find local youth, they can very well. But please understand that for each of these steps, there is a petition process, which means you have to spend your precious, productive time, organizations, in terms of seeking these approvals and proving your point. Rather than that, wouldn't it have been much better to have said that, listen, if you hire somebody from outside, it's a deemed declaration that you did not find somebody locally. And honestly, it's not really easy or a preferred choice for any employer to go and hire people from other states if they can find the right people with the right skill set within the state, because there are a lot of issues associated with hiring people from outside of states. So finally, this is what it's leading to, is creating more disincentive for the state of Haryana with keeping in mind the need for creating overall more jobs and good quality formal jobs within the state. And hence, it is actually going against the very youth that it is trying to protect, because these incentives will affect employers in such a way that they will be prompted to move to other states or other destinations, which means all jobs will go away. And that is definitely not a healthy or a preferred situation. And this seems like a extremely knee-jerk reaction to the challenges faced by during the pandemic. If I were the state government, I would actually focus my energies in providing a lot more creative incentives to get employers to come to Haryana and invest more in Haryana and create more jobs, rather than this kind of a preventive policy which is just created disincentives which affect local youth and youth from elsewhere equally and not otherwise.
Mr. Gupta, in your first response, you gave the example of nurses, saying that, everyone knows that there are a lot of nurses hailing from Kerala, more easily hireable, and what happens if you run a hospital and then you have to source locally. The counter argument to that could be that are you suggesting that nurses, say from another state or from Haryana, cannot also learn? The government wants to incentivize companies to also add skills to its local population. Do you think that there is a middle ground that industry can reach on that?
There is no incentive per se. Let me first clarify that in many states, like we have seen, where a new industrial cluster is created, like in Uttarakhand or Baddi or places like that in Himachal, when they offer a new industrial township or an industrial setup, they come up with incentives, tax benefits and other benefits. And there, if you are asking somebody to have a local employment, then it's like a win-win situation for both, the state also and the employer also. But in Haryana, let me clarify, Haryana is one of the most prosperous states in the country. And the industry is not getting land at free rate. The industry has to get it on auctions. It's not even allotment. If Haryana government is giving an industrial plot, these are auctioned. And in auction, the highest bidder gets. So there are no concessions per se to the industry. Had they been giving incentives, and it would have been open to the one, rather the Haryana policy, the Haryana enterprise policy says that if a local person is hired, then the state will incentivize by giving 48,000 for 7 to 10 years. So when the incentive is there, then why the compulsion of a penal law? Let somebody who wants to avail the incentive, they may avail for it. But now, and it is not even applicable on new units. Like Rituparna said, if suppose we are creating some industrial setup and we say, okay, those who want to avail a particular unit in these or who wants to set up, they will get X benefits and they will have to give an undertaking that they will be employing 75%. That is like a contractual thing that somebody is doing. Now, suddenly you think that it has to be across the board on all employers without any incentive, without any reason or rhyme or a scientific data to substantiate that Haryana youth is backward, Haryana youth is unemployed, or Haryana youth needs this kind of a law. It's actually not rational. And I again go back to that principle that whether private employment can be compelled to reserve. See, then why the only domicile reservation? Yeah. Tomorrow we'll come up with those reservations we have in other sectors. Let's bring in the SCs, the STs, the OBCs and other sectors also. And then the general category will not be left in the private sector also, as it is happening in other government sectors. Where will the general category go? So private sector so far has to be competitive not only in India, but they have to be competitive across the globe. And if we take away that competitiveness because of these reservations and the quotas, it is going to affect the economy overall. So there is a logic why this has been kept out so far.
So Mr. Gupta, if I understand correctly, just in connection with the Haryana rule, you're saying this is not going to be prospective for new units if it does come to pass after the High Court order,
to everybody.
but it will also impact existing.
Everybody.
It will impact existing units as well.
It has already impacted. See, the Supreme Court has only clarified that there is no coercive order, but the Act is in force from 15th of January. So the Act is in force even today. the coercive action is not there, and it impacts every establishment, more than lakhs. If we take into account the industry and the shops and everybody, it is already impacting lakhs of employers.
So the cutoff is for any employer which hires more than 10 people, which keeps the threshold fairly low. Rituparna, I want to come to the larger question of jobs over here. And, you know, even as we're seeing all of the comments coming in through electioneering and this election polls going on in 5 states right now, jobs is a huge issue. And then there is a vast number of young Indians who feel they just don't have the opportunity. How can their concerns be addressed? How can they be given a platform where they can compete with other people from different states who may have had a better grounding in that particular skill set? That really is the grouse, isn't it?
You raise the most critical issue. You know, gone are the days where our youth could be misled into believing that through reservations, they are going to get themselves a job. It's very clear to even them that for them to land a job, the net sum of jobs in the country needs to increase, and net sum of quality jobs need to increase. And hence, if it is an election agenda, I mean, it would augur well, honestly, for governments to actually focus on the grassroots problems which are ailing job creation locally in certain states. For example, you brought up the point on nurses and the lack of availability of the skill set in the state of Haryana for this profile. And like Haryana, many such states have underinvested in a critical skill like nursing, right? Now, I actually am surprised that why is that not the responsibility of the government? Why is the government not owning up to actually creating these basic infrastructure around having education, which is linked to livelihood, around having skilling and upgradation program, which actually improves the chances and odds of our kids who are graduates but have subsistence level of income, because their graduation has no linkage to their opportunity, to their ability to get themselves a job. Why would governments not focus on these initiatives? Why not create center of excellence which improves digital skills all over? You just saw the NASSCOM report, which actually talks about how India is at that particular crossroad where the kind of demand and the volume of jobs India can create can outnumber all the rest of the world's demand altogether. And even some upskilling programs are not sufficient. So when the government starts making those investments, I think that's when you start showing intent, and that's when our youth are going to read them as proactive steps towards actually government coming in towards securing their future. Reservations do not secure future when the number of jobs itself is limited. Like, it's not going to help anyone in the long run.
I want to come to the issue of skilling, because often when we talk about this issue, we talk about employment, unemployment. It's also about candidates out there having the right skill set for the jobs that are available. And this is a conversation that comes up often, that there are jobs there, but it's very difficult to find the right skilled candidates. Mr. Sabanvis, would you like to throw light on that? Because governments have successfully had several skilling programs, but they don't seem to have moved the needle in any real way.
I think there's a lot of inequality when it comes to education in the country. And we should remember that at the end of the day, you need to have a certain kind of an education to get into a certain kind of an organization. So which also goes along with the skill sets. And I think the way in which we have been harping a lot in terms of regional language education, I think it's the starting point of this inequality, because for all practical purposes, if you do not have an English education, you will not be getting into the best kind of school. If you don't go to the best kind of school, you probably will not qualify for the best kind of college. And the same thing holds for any kind of professional education. So I think that's the major problem which is there. There is a case of surplus students, there's a case of limited amount of seats, a limited amount of wealth which is there. So I think this goes back to saying that there is a certain level of inequality which is there in terms of income, which gets manifested in terms of what kind of an education we can give our own children. And that is something which finally gets reflected in terms of the ultimate skills which people have, which tend to be concentrated with people who are better off. And they're the ones who would ultimately end up getting the jobs. So today what we're talking of is a case of saying that it is at the lower income level where there will be these kind of issues of saying that I want to have reservations. So I think that's why the threshold has been kept at 30,000. Though I still believe 30,000 is still a fairly high amount. There are lots of people we find these, what you call your Uber taxi people or your Zomato delivery boys who earn much lower amount. And there are lots of educated people who are doing these kind of jobs. So definitely it is a case of underinvestment. And it probably helps society itself, because if I have too many people who are going into IIMs, everybody is a management graduate, I don't have enough jobs coming up because the economy is not growing at that particular pace to lead to this kind of demand for these kind of skill sets.
You know, recently we had this report about how thousands and thousands of applicants lined up for jobs in the railways, and in fact it broke out into protests and then violence because they wanted to apply for jobs where the qualification was 10th grade, and even those who are much more educated were applying for it. So coming back to you, Mr. Gupta, on the skills part of it, you will agree that there is an issue nationwide, that there is a problem, that you have a lot of people with qualifications, but you have relatively fewer jobs. What do you think industry needs to create more jobs? Because that at the end of the day is the solution, isn't it?
I think that's the real thing, what you were saying, Tamanna, that instead of having a law, if the state governments start in a collaborative manner with the industry and the other stakeholders, the other NGOs, where they come up with the idea of developing a skill development centers in the various skills that the youth of a particular state would need. I mean, Haryana has a lot of industries. If the Haryana government would say that, okay, let's partner and we have ITIs which normally have very limited skills to impart. If they align the big corporates from the state of Haryana, or maybe the central government and state government could come up with a scheme where the CSR funds could be spent, the corporates may be allowed to spend the CSR funds on the skill development of a particular state. Then in case if we are able to create world-class infrastructure or skill development centers, which could also meet the need of the prospective employers, and at the same time incentivize if they are able to employ the local people, we don't need a law. And please appreciate, Haryana is a particular geography. It is bordered with most number of states. It is bordered with UP, it is bordered with Delhi, it is bordered with Punjab and Himachal, and also Rajasthan. Now, a particular district may be closer to a district in another state than the rest of the Haryana. Gurgaon is far up from Sirsa or Bhiwani or other places, while Gurgaon may be closer to Bhiwadi, which is next door to Rajasthan. So a local employer from an adjoining state may still be cheaper and still be better than a compulsion on hiring from other part. But if we have those world-class skill development centers across the state and in other states as well, then I think nobody would prefer going for an outside state people. And that is also in line with what our Honorable Prime Minister has been emphasizing on the Skill India movement. We have set up a lot of organizations for Skill India. It's just that we need to put that into practice, have those alliances with the right side of people, the industry, the NGOs, like Rotary and other places, and even the local RWS or a hospital. Like if we need a skill development, we saw that in COVID time that we were not getting quality healthcare workers. Some people needed to set up attendants at the home. We did not have that manpower. So if we can, depending upon the need and the requirement and the strength of a geography, we can have skill development centers for hospitality or for medical or for engineering or those sectors. Maybe we won't need to, run out of options within the state, and we don't need a law for that purpose.
So,
otherwise, the risk is
one
more point. Otherwise, the risk is. I'm sorry to interrupt. The risk is if every state tomorrow, for a political reason or otherwise, comes up with this law, we are
No,
seeing
but
a
they're already
situation
planning
where
it. They're already
that's what
planning
I'm
it.
saying.
And that is the point I was making, that we're talking about one particular state, but let's tell you that this case is a very crucial one because it sets a template for what other states can or will do in the future. So this is an issue we need to watch very closely. Perhaps it's time to give a carrot rather than a stick to industry to, kind of find a solution to the problem of better paying, better quality and sustainable jobs that the youth really needs. With that, I'll have to wrap, but I want to thank all of you for joining us on the show today.